Hello, my name is Paul Mattingly, and this will be a case analysis of the NASA Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. And this is for Policy 510, Public Management with UMass Dartmouth. So to begin, Columbia STS-107 disaster. This occurred on February 1st, 2003, when the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, Space Shuttle Columbia during Space Transportation System Mission 107, which will be further referred to as STS-107, disintegrated during re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, killing all 7 astronauts. While this was one specific incident, the environment for this to be able to occur was made possible by a few specific factors. First off would be the political pressures put on the organization, a insular management system, and then finally organizational pressures creating acceptance of continuing safety concerns. Now, to help better understand how it got to that point and to see how it was created, you have a little bit of historical background on NASA. So NASA was first formed in 1958 in direct response to the success of the Soviet Union space program. And from the start, NASA was already behind. The first satellite was launched by the Soviets, Sputnik 1, in 1957. And then the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, happened on April 12, 1961. Now, President Kennedy followed with just a month later his famous moonshot speech to Congress. And in this, he challenged American scientists to land a man on the moon and then return him safely to the Earth before the decade was over. And this was the beginning of timelines being put and schedules and imposed on NASA by external factors, specifically presidents often. Now, this created enormous amounts of pressure and time constraints, just a still new program. We have to remember that NASA was only 3 years old at this time. NASA successfully completed this mission, though, on July 20th, 1969, with the Apollo 11 mission. Now, with this lunar mission now completed, President Nixon introduced the shuttle program in 1972 with the intention of creating a system to repeatedly shuttle people back and forth from Earth to orbit and safely back, and specifically also cargo as well. Now, the shuttle program was intended to revolutionize space travel to near space, making it routine and common. There was a goal of 50 flights per year, which is something they would never come close to achieving. And then to help offset the cost, the shuttle would carry commercial goods and also military payloads as well. So that was why the shuttle was designed with a large cargo area compared to the prior missions, which were mostly focused on just transporting a little bit of scientific equipment and then a small crew of only usually 3 astronauts. The crew would grow to 7 people because of the larger space and also more of a mission-specific needs. So NASA began full-scale production in 1977 with 4 shuttles. The first is Atlantis, Challenger, Columbia, and Discovery. The inaugural flight took place on April 12, 1981. And now the next challenge by a president was with President Reagan on January 25, 1984, during his State of the Union address. He issued NASA the challenge of developing a permanently manned space station before the decade was over. Now, due to cost overruns after the initial congressional approval, this was expanded to be an international effort, which then became the International Space Station. We also do have to focus on the other failed missions that NASA had before Columbia. So over the course of NASA's manned spaceflight missions, there was 4 major incidents, with 3 of them being fatal. The first was Apollo 1 in 1967, where a flash fire occurred during a launch pad test, killing all 3 astronauts. Now, after this, there was a number of safety measures instituted after an investigation was aimed at increasing safety and reliability of future missions. The next failed mission was thankfully not fatal, but this was Apollo 13 in 1970, when an oxygen tank failure in the service module caused the mission to have to be aborted. But NASA was able to successfully return the astronauts to Earth. But still, again, this was a failed mission. Now, additional changes were implemented after another investigation to prevent future issues. Next was the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion after takeoff in 1986, killing all 7 astronauts. Another investigation followed, and it was concluded that O-ring failures due to abnormally low temperatures in Florida, low 20 degrees, caused a catastrophic failure resulting in an explosion. Now, the O-ring issues had dated back to 1977, but it was deemed not to be a serious concern. Now, the final fatal mission would be the Space Shuttle Columbia, which, as we mentioned, disintegrated during re-entry in 2003, killing all 7 astronauts. Now, after the Columbia disaster, there was an investigation, which was called the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the CAIB. And this was formed to find the causes of the disaster. So there was a 13-member board of former astronauts, transportation safety officers, aerospace experts, and others. From this investigation, they concluded that the disintegration of the shuttle was the result of an external fuel tank foam tile installation shedding during takeoff and striking the left wing of the orbiter, causing damage to the heat shielding that protects the orbiter during extremely hot gases produced while entering the Earth's atmosphere. This foam tile insulation shedding, though, was a problem from the very start of the shuttle program, and it occurred on the very first flight in 1981. It continued to occur with nearly every flight, and over time, it became not only expected, but also accepted. Eventually, it was deemed as a maintenance issue, regardless that in 1990, it was actually initially termed a safety of flight issue. After Challenger, there were 89 successful flights, so was determined to be an acceptable risk. So the history of the foam tile insulation orbiter strikes. Prior to Columbia, there were 6 significant incidents of foam tile insulation strikes to the orbiter. The first occurrence, as we mentioned, was early on in the program with a strike in 1983. And this continued from 1983 till the Columbia disaster of 2000. Most significant strike was on STS mission 112, which immediately preceded the Columbia STS-107 mission. Now, during the STS-107 mission, a debris assessment team of 34 engineers was formed after concerns about the orbiter strike were raised after reviewing video of the launch. Ultimately, they were not able to have their concerns taken seriously. So, after that kind of background on not only the history, but then also some of the technical issues that had happened with the missions, how was the environment for accidents created? So while there are many different factors that come into this, there were some recurring contributing factors. There's 3 main ones: a culture of schedule and budgetary pressures, a culture of minimization and complacency, and finally, a culture of centralized insular management system. All of these factors had to be combined to create a culture to allow for the Columbia disaster to occur. So the first off I'll talk about is a culture of schedule and budgetary pressures. As we mentioned earlier, NASA from its inception was continually under pressure to meet deadlines, and especially from presidents. First off, it was formed in response to the Soviet Union space program, heightened because of the Cold War. Next was President Kennedy's moonshot speech and challenge. Then was President Nixon's goal of 50 flights per year. And lastly, President Reagan's goal of a manned permanently station in space. Now, funding was also a part of the discretionary federal budget, so it was often coming under scrutiny, especially when it was already behind schedule and over budget. If you're one of those, it's an issue, but when you're both, it's especially a problem. Now, later on, there were 2 different directors that were appointed, with both being charged with getting the program back on schedule and containing costs. Most pertinent to the Columbia disaster was this Node 2 deadline of February 19th, 2004, as that was the target for having all U.S. components of the International Space Station to be in space and it was very impactful as a scheduling pressure in relation to the shuttle program. And it made it very important that every mission went off on time, or else they would not be able to meet that date. And it was such an important factor that there was constant reminders within the organization, to the level that there was a screensaver sent out to everyone that counted down the days, the minutes, the hours, the seconds till that date came. Next of the major contributing factors would be a culture of minimization and complacency. Very often, concerns and doubts were routinely minimized when approaching launch time. There was a viewpoint of nothing is ever 100%, and you never have any launches if you listen to every concern. And they also then put the burden of proof upon the person bringing up the concern, which was against great pressure, and there was such a pressure to keep the missions going forward and on schedule that there was a big disincentivizing of creating and causing any concerns. There was also informal and nebulous terms used for safety concerns, which at the same time also minimized the importance of them. There's something called an anomaly, which has a specific meaning and a specific course of action to address it. But when informal terms such as out of family or in family are used, it is much easier to explain away. And then complacency was also in effect due to a belief that because safety issues had not caused a major problem yet, they were not a danger, such as the foam tile strikes. With 89 successful flights since Challenger, then it must not be a problem because it hasn't been one yet. And finally, there was a centralized and insular management system. The mission management team, the MMT, became the main driver and evaluator of decisions within the organization. This was an issue because the management system was intended to be decentralized, but over time it became very centralized in the MMT. Now, the MMT was responsible for the overall schedule adherence, so they had a vested interest in pushing forward. Now, while the MMT was primary in this management system, if there was a team or a group that fell outside of their scope or outside of the chain of command, the management system was not set up to handle this change. The most impactful example for the Columbia disaster was the debris assessment team that we mentioned earlier. Now, they were not able to get authorization for additional information from other agencies because those requests were then funneled back to the MMT as the decision maker for this authorization, which was a major conflict of interest. And then the MMT minimized it and said it was just a maintenance issue as they had determined before. And there's been all these successful flights, so we do not need to worry about it. So what are our conclusions from these? First off, the largest contributing factor to the Columbia disaster was the constant pressure of deadlines. This was something that was recurring and happened very often within NASA, as we highlighted. Now, related to schedule pressures, budgetary pressures also reinforced the pressure to meet deadlines. There's the phrasing, time is money, and that is never more evident than in NASA space shuttle missions. There was also the insular management system, specifically the MMT, which resulted in safety concerns being minimized because it was not in their best interest to delay things. Now, there was also skill and expertise that existed within the organization that was discounted and not relied on, specifically the debris assessment team. They were able to see that there was an issue and there was a major concern, and they had the expertise to notice it, and they needed more information to be able to evaluate the situation, but they were denied it. Now, complacency on a relatively small sample size helped to create an accepting of safety risks. This idea that because we had so many safe missions that were run and nothing catastrophic happened, then it must not be an issue and we can move on. So what would be some recommendations to help prevent future issues and future disasters such as this? First off is that NASA, as well as other organizations that are embarking on technologies and application of technologies that are still new and evolving, should have greater control over their own schedules. Now, they are spending the public's money, and it is a public organization that's governed by the government, but They should be able to set their schedules based upon their knowledge of the science and their knowledge of what is needed to safely do it. There should also be a robust and open procedure for evaluating safety concerns. Specifically, that those evaluating the risks and concerns should not be those that have a vested interest in it. This is one of those independent arbiters or an independent investigation. You always want to have the independence so that vested interest is not influencing the decisions. And finally, as mentioned before, limited sample sizes should not determine the evaluation of risks. There was somebody on the investigation board, the CAIB, who had mentioned that they had said that the mission was safe and it was good to go, and then it was in no way close to what it would take in the aerospace industry for it to be deemed safe and reliable. So for such a small sample size, they cannot deduce that it is a safety of a mission. So this was a case analysis of the NASA Spatial Columbia disaster, and my name is Paul Mattingly again at UMass Dartmouth for Policy 510. Thank you.